Hi everyone, Jessica Deal here. This week I'm going to talk about the agrarian landscape. As an overview, we're going to cover urban planning and agriculture, then talk a little bit about the Green Revolution again, and then go through a series of case studies using a political ecology lens, including theoretical, methodological, and political approaches to understanding the agrarian landscape. Historically, urban planners focused on urban functions of the city. Agriculture was considered a rural function, and urban land was not allocated for cultivation. Separating agriculture from city land uses was cited as a public health issue. However, the industries replacing agriculture tended to be even more pollution prone. In addition to displacement by industry, planners prioritized uses to increase land values by converting agriculture land to residential or commercial uses. City zoning maps often do not include agriculture as a designated land use, and it is typically subsumed under open space or undeveloped land uses. But excluding agriculture as part of urban planning and development has created this somewhat dichotomized landscape where you have rural agriculture and urban infrastructure. But yet the dependence of urban populations on agriculture remains. And so you have this real coupled system of urban and rural dependence. I hope some of you are familiar with the concept of urban metabolism, and this is a way of understanding the city as uniquely dependent on the inputs from the rural landscape, dependent on a variety of resources, including food, which comes into the city and is consumed or changed in some way, and then output as some sort of waste. Urban metabolism is a way of looking at flows of materials and energy within the system. And when we think about agriculture and the food system and the dependency of the urban context, we can conceptualize it in terms of a food footprint or a food shed. And so here you can see the city as the built-up land, and it's surrounded by a variety of agrarian landscapes that are producing for that urban context, including fishing grounds, grazing land, cropland, forest land, and a place for the carbon to go. At issue is the fact that as cities have grown exponentially, they're starting to rely on the same agrarian landscapes to support their urban populations. And so we get this kind of condition that some have labeled desicota. And desicota is a term used in urban geography to describe areas in the extended surroundings of large cities, where urban and agricultural forms of land use and settlement coexist and are intensively intermingled. And so you can see here an example of a desicota where the red blobs are the urban centers, then the green blobs are the agrarian settlement, but then you have this orange area where the city is urbanizing and starting to consume that agrarian landscape. And as the city grows, one city will encroach on another's food footprint. So there becomes this real tension and competition. As this happens, we become acutely aware of urban reliance on rural food sheds. With climate change and urbanization, coupled with threats to urban food security, environmental degradation, and rising enemy among urban dwellers, that means disintegration rather than cooperation, there is this renewed effort to reintroduce agriculture into the city, make it more explicit in urban planning and zoning regulations. Increasingly, city governments and planners endeavor to make their cities more self-reliant in food production. And this is motivated by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 2, which is for zero hunger and a global focus on urban food security. So let's talk about what is urban agriculture. It is uniquely different from rural agriculture in a number of ways. And let me start with a common definition. Luc Mageau is commonly cited, and he defines urban agriculture as an industry that produces, processes, and markets food, fuel, and other outputs, largely in response to the daily demand of consumers within a town, city, or metropolis, on many types of privately and publicly held land and water bodies found throughout the intra-urban and peri-urban areas. So let me just stop for a second and highlight that it's not just food for consumption, but it includes other types of products and resources that the urban people will need. So not just food, but also fuel and other outputs such as building materials, wood products, fiber products, etc. Now here's where it gets even more unique. Typically, urban agriculture applies intensive productive methods. It frequently uses and reuses natural resources and urban wastes to yield a diverse array of land, water, and air-based fauna and flora, contributing to the food security, health, livelihood, and environment of individual, household, and community. So it's quite a comprehensive definition, not limited to growing food products. And there are many positive benefits of the practice of urban agriculture. First, it can take a variety of forms, not just traditional land-based forms, but can be anything from small-scale community gardens to medium-scale urban farms to large-scale food forests. Beyond the benefits of producing food, urban agriculture can be understood as a microsystem embedded in the macro-scale economic, social, ecological, and physical infrastructure systems of the city. Linked to city systems, urban agriculture touches issues of food security, unemployment, and economic opportunity, education, habitat creation, stormwater mitigation, and other ecosystem services. So there are a variety of peripheral benefits that can be incurred through the practice of urban agriculture. On the other hand, and at the same time, there are potential negative threats or ramifications. So while there are many positives, at the same time, agriculture in, around, or on the peri-urban fringe of the city can be polluting. It can be exclusionary, marginalizing, and fail to be productive. It's threatened by land scarcity and insecurity due to land use competition, which we'll talk about later. And it is at risk for contamination by pollution emitted by vehicles, heavy metals in soils, organic chemicals, and urban sanitization. So it threatens the urban environment, and is also threatened by the urban environment in terms of potential pollution. Notably, if the systems that urban agriculture is embedded in are not sustainable, it is unlikely that urban agriculture is going to be sustainable itself. And this poses a real challenge for city planners, landscape architects, and urban residents. So let's take a little broader perspective and talk about the land itself. In the urban context, land competition and rising land values in and around cities have prompted a focus on increasing food supply without increasing agricultural area. So we don't want to use more land because land is precious. So we need to produce more food in the same amount of land. So this has resulted in a focus on high-tech solutions. Improved technology and intensification of agriculture is not a new idea. The Green Revolution increased the inputs of mineral fertilizer, agrochemicals, and other external inputs in order to produce more outputs. But many of these solutions prove to be unsustainable and cannot be the future model. So what was the Green Revolution? Research and development of technology that increased agricultural production worldwide particularly in the developing world in the late 1960s, was the precursor for this phenomenon. The new technologies included new high-yielding varieties of cereals, especially dwarf wheats and rices. These were combined with chemical fertilizers and agrochemicals, and with controlled water supply, which usually involved irrigation, and new methods of cultivation, including mechanization. All of these methods represented a package of practices that replaced traditional technology. So basically, it was a combination of new varieties of crops that were dependent on chemical fertilizers and other kinds of inputs, then had a very controlled water supply, and it was put together as a package. Now let's watch a short video by scholar Iman El-Shiak as she introduces the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution literally revolutionized the way that we produce food as a human species. Yet the costs and criticisms are multiple. And now I call your attention back to the story of Orissa and the roots of political ecology. So recall that while the Green Revolution was ongoing, in 1978, the government of India and NGOs set out to modernize cattle breeding in the poorest communities in Orissa. Basically, a program designed to improve the lives and livelihoods of the poor, in fact, actually made them more poor, as well as depleted their environmental resources and biodiversity. So we have to ask, why did the authorities do it? Why were local practices dismissed? Who benefited? For this, we need political ecology to answer these complex questions. Before we get into some case examples using a political ecology lens, I want to define a few more aspects of the agrarian landscape, beginning with the food system. While the agrarian landscape is about food production, as I've already called out in some of the definitions, it's about more than just producing food. It's about a system that's can be embedded in the urban system. So how does growing food become part of a food system? Broadly, the urban food system is comprised of food production, processing, distribution, retail and market, consumption, and waste, which can then be recovered and turned back into food production, though it rarely is. It also occurs within a geographic footprint, which can be from local to global. And so I've already shown you some images of food footprints, but they can be defined across multiple scales. The food system is also dependent on resources. As I noted, it's dependent on land, it's dependent on seeds and labor, infrastructure. There are lots of physical conditions and intangibles that make the food system sustainable or unsustainable. It comprises various cultural conditions, including actor health, consumer food preferences, sales, etc. If we think about the food supply chain, looking at those different aspects of the food system, we can start to describe how food goes from farm and ends up on your tables, and then where it goes from there. I'm sure you've heard of food supply chains and short food supply chains. These are characterized by short physical distances or involvement of few intermediaries between producers and consumers. As the food supply chain has become more globalized, the short chains that used to exist in the past have now become international food supply chains with many, many intermediaries. Conceptualizing urban farming as embedded in the urban economic, social, and ecological system suggests that sustainable practice is not just about connecting farms to consumers through short supply chains, but also connecting farms to all aspects of the urban food system, to allow for adaptability to changes and eventually leading to more resiliency. This is a framework that was proposed that highlights the discourse around concepts and definitions of food systems, increasingly emphasizing the dynamic nature underpinning the functioning of elements and activities which inherently drive the sustainability and future of food security. So you can see here aspects of the food system in terms of production and distribution, consumption, and then outputs, and then the multiple drivers, feedbacks, and stakeholders that interact with that system. There is no shortage of frameworks that describe the food system, and I encourage you to search for others. But now I want to shift gears and anchor some of these broader concepts in real-world examples using political ecology and the three prongs of it related to theory, methodology, and political commitments. Beginning with a theoretical lens, which combines critical social theory and a post-positivist understanding of nature in the production of knowledge about it, which views these as inseparable from social relations of power. I'll begin by describing my own fieldwork. During my PhD research, I wanted to understand how urban farmers in Delhi, India were fertilizing their crops, to understand if they were using sustainable practices and what was going on. What I found was actually that they were threatened by land development and encroachment on their farm fields, and while they were important stakeholders in the landscape they cultivated, they were not being engaged by the city government in the process of determining what was going to be developed, where it was going to be developed, and how it was going to be developed. So rather than focusing on the environmental aspects of urban farming in Delhi, my research really turned into an in-depth case study of poor marginalized urban farmers who were facing land development. I wanted to explore how power relationships impacted their planning participation and livelihood strategies. And this was motivated by the United Nations Human Settlements Program, which recognizes community participation as an essential component of sustainable planning and development. But what happens when the community doesn't include those who are directly impacted by development, such as on degraded land occupied by poor and marginalized groups? Delhi is one of the largest megacities in the world with more than 25 million people, and it's growing exponentially. Despite the dense urban fabric, the Yamuna River flows through the city center and is surrounded by a wide floodplain. The Yamuna River floodplain is home to more than 2,500 farmers. The majority are rural immigrants. I conducted a series of household interviews in 2013 and 2014 to measure social networks and to understand where they came from, why they chose this place to cultivate, and to understand their plans and what they would do if the land was developed. The research was conducted through a Hindi translator, and the data that I collected were analyzed both qualitatively and quantitatively. The dense urban fabric of Delhi is built right up to the edge of the floodplain. It's clearly definable in this image. It floods annually during the summer monsoon right up to that urban edge. So the Yamuna River floodplain is surrounded by rapid development, urbanization, and political change. Despite a long list of environmental issues, such as the Yamuna River is considered one of the most severely polluted rivers in the world, development is already happening on the floodplain. And the farmers that I was interviewing were experiencing displacement and loss of land while metro construction was ongoing. While I'm not going to get too deep into the theoretical approach that I used, I want to present this case study because it gives you an idea of the complexity of theory that can be applied to these kinds of cases to understand more clearly environmental, social, economic, political conditions within the lens of political ecology. For my research, I used what's called the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework. It evolved from vulnerability resilience literature in response to rural development and was conceptualized as a framework for understanding the process of creating sustainable livelihoods. In defining the Sustainable Livelihood Framework concepts, the author states that a livelihood comprises the capabilities, assets, including both material and social resources, and the activities for means of living. A livelihood is sustainable when it can cope with and recover from stresses and shocks, maintain or enhance its capabilities and assets, while not undermining its natural resource base. So in order to understand livelihood outcomes, we need to understand, and whether they're sustainable, we need to understand livelihood strategies. And in order to understand those, we need to understand all of the livelihood assets that the community group or household itself is comprised of, as well as the structures and processes of the larger level government and rules and regulations and policies, as well as the vulnerability context, which is really the environment and environmental changes. So we need to understand a variety of levels of processes and embedded resources. And within this, we can start to understand how livelihood strategies made by, in this case, the farmers themselves, lead to livelihood outcomes in their actual practices. And I really began with this notion that an individual may have the potential to act, right, to strategize, but it is only by understanding which actions are possible, and that's within the broader transforming structures and processes of government, within which context, so that relates to culture, laws, and policies, within and with whom, so the people that they interact with, so which actions are possible in which context and with whom, that we can really understand what action is likely to occur. And so I looked at this framework in 4 different aspects. I applied Eric Wolf's theory of social power relations, which Eric Wolf is one of the sort of precursors of political ecology. And he saw power as always being relational and happening through different modes. He saw a structural mode of power, which is organized by the big picture, sort of the overarching government, political economy. Then he saw the organizational level where power manifests as control over a setting, which relates to the more tangible things like laws and policies and institutions. Then he saw power relations within ego-alter mode of power, which is really individuals interacting with each other. And then finally, the last mode of power he defined as the individual, and this is really the power to act. So I extracted this theory and overlaid them together to start to understand how the Delhi farmers were making decisions based on the context of their agrarian landscape. Beginning with their livelihood assets, I really wanted to understand how they influenced and accessed various sorts of capital through the people that they interacted with across the food system, which then helped me understand how they were embedded in both the vulnerability context and the transforming structures and processes. So at this point, I needed to call to social network theory to start to understand how the farmers might influence and access different forms of capital through the people that they were interacting with. Again, this isn't a comprehensive description of the theoretical approach of my research, but it's really just intended to give you a sense of the complexity that's required to take a theoretical approach that then forms a solid foundation for gaining deeper understanding of the processes and the phenomena that are happening. In summary, I combined the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework with Eric Wolf's theory of ego alter or relational power, which then I combined with social network theory. And from that, I developed a series of assumptions that formed the basis for my interview guide. In order for me to understand power as a social phenomenon, I had to operationalize how that access and use of resources through social networks might actually happen and be able to ask questions so that I could observe and document how it was happening and if farmers had high amounts of power or low amounts of power or somewhere in between. In the end, I collected a vast amount of qualitative and quantitative data, which I combined together and tried to make sense of in terms of patterns and categories. And in the end, I was able to create an aggregated understanding of how social networks were influencing the way that households were making livelihood decisions within the context of the threat of land development and keeping in mind that their primary livelihood was an agrarian approach. So everyone that they were interacting with was part of that food system, whether it was getting seeds and inputs and fertilizers from a industry shop or selling their harvest to a local vendor who would then sell it to the market or selling to customers directly themselves. And then also understanding, if their landlords were helping them in any way, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is a brief snapshot of some of the things that I found. And by taking this more nuanced approach of understanding power through social networks, I was able to categorize households across 8 different types of contexts. Those from starting with those that had no capital at all, they were very powerless, all the way down to those that had strong capital. They had strong social networks within their household, among the farm community, and then reaching out, extending into the larger food system and outside the community itself. And within those categories, I was able to start to understand how vulnerable they were and versus resilient and how they were coping with the land development. In going back to the quantitative data, I found that strong social networks were significantly associated with more detailed land use knowledge, so they knew more about what was going on. They had more detailed general knowledge. They generally knew more about what was happening in the community. And they had more of a perceived ability to influence land use planning and development. So those with strong social networks thought maybe they could have some kind of protest or resist some of the development. Households with detailed livelihood strategies were more likely to be involved in activities such as protests and going to meetings related to land use change. And those planning to stay in Delhi rather than move away were more likely to be involved in those kinds of activities. Those with detailed livelihood strategies were also more likely to perceive that their activities had an influence. I found that the relationship between perceived ability to influence land use planning and development and livelihood strategies was, in one sense, clear. Farmers perceived they had no or minimal influence. Generally, the farmers were very disempowered, and they were either planning to leave or had no plans at all. But of the few households who believed they had some kind of influence, more than half of them gave detailed livelihood strategies, and they also exhibited strong social networks. Households with detailed livelihood strategies had 3 times the odds of believing they had influence on land use planning and development. They, as I said, they were more likely to have strong social networks overall, and often had some sort of landlord or someone politically connected advocating for them. So while I was looking for, while I was, it seemed on the surface that the farmers were very disempowered and very vulnerable to land development. Through my research, what I found was that there were several households that were well connected and had the potential to have some kind of influence. And this kind of information is incredibly useful for advocates who might be able to go in and work with those few households to start to mobilize the larger community. So without that kind of nuanced on the ground understanding, we would miss that kind of connection totally. Some of the other things that I learned related specifically to political ecology were some of the direct and indirect benefits of the farmers farming the Yamuna floodplain. Because why were they there? You know, it was a land very precarious, threatened by urbanization. So why would they want to be there? I think that's something that we often ask of marginalized groups. Why do you tolerate such poor conditions? Well, the most direct livelihood benefit of farming in Delhi was that there was more profit and they were close to the market. Very simple, they made more money. The indirect benefits from living in a city ranged from access to education and healthcare to having streetlights, which extended the activities into the evening. So many of them came from rural villages where these things just didn't exist or were very poor quality. On the other hand, the rural barriers that they faced in their villages included not having enough land for farming to be profitable, not having enough water for irrigation, and there being domestic and wild animals that destroyed their crops. Some of the migrants had left their village because they didn't have opportunities. They had to migrate to Delhi, whereas others saw opportunities in moving. They wanted to migrate. And these are 2 very different types of contexts and conditions. Now, let me come back to the direct motivation of income, which is really an important driver of migration. I want to emphasize that the benefits to living and farming in Delhi were plural, but the main reasons were that farmers earned a higher income in Delhi and that there was not enough land in their migrant villages. Let me say that again a different way. Farmers migrated to a highly urbanized, densely populated city to farm because their rural villages didn't have enough land. It's as simple as that. On the surface, it's quite astounding that those were the motivations. But through my research, I found that those were powerful drivers of migration. While there are many, many more things I would like to talk about related to the urban farmers in Delhi, I want to shift gears and talk about the methodological lens. Political ecology calls for an in-depth, direct observation involving qualitative research of some sort, often in combination with quantitative methods and/or document analysis. Now, it's clear what I've already presented had a methodological lens. I really want to emphasize the theoretical approach. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the kinds of methodologies that I've applied. And the first case study that I want to talk about using a methodological lens is farming in Singapore. And it's based on a presentation that I gave titled Roots versus Reach, a Political Ecology of Traditional Farmers in Singapore. In terms of the research overview, just a little background context. Of course, we know that growing urban populations increase demand for food, coupled with the inherent risks of relying on the global food system, has spurred city governments to implement strategies for integrating urban agriculture at different scales. Singapore is a city-state that imports 90% of its food, and this makes it increasingly vulnerable to food insecurity, particularly evident during the global pandemic. While arable land in Singapore shrinks due to development, there is increasing interest in domestic food production, and this is the 30 by 30 goal. So this research investigated traditional farming using the lens of political ecology to better understand food security in Singapore. This is based on the assumption that the focus on high-tech operations might not achieve the food independence the Singapore government aims for without incorporating some of that traditional farming. And also that urban agriculture, while it is technical, it's an activity, it is also directly driven by the people who are practicing it. So agriculture has changed dramatically since Singapore's independence in 1965. This map shows the changing landscape of agriculture as it has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk and is now concentrated up in the northwest Lim Chu Kang area, and it's shrinking even more. I think this map is even already old. It's 2 years old. It's shrunk even more. Today, Singapore is classified as 100% urban. 90% of its land is state-owned. Large-scale urban farms are located up in the northwest, occupying less than 1% of land. Commercial farming is also restricted to poultry, eggs, fish, and primarily vegetables. As part of this research, I compiled a list of 48 farms, of which 42 were traditional, with some that also incorporated some technology, high-tech, such as hydroponics, and the remaining 6 were high-tech. Sampled 16 farms and did in-depth interviews. In comparison to this sample, there are 150 orchid farms in Singapore, just as a point of reference. The majority of farms interviewed applied traditional systems, 5 including hydroponic. They grew vegetables, but also some poultry and fish. 6 of the farms were organic or applied agroecological principles, which means that they interplanted. It was not a monoculture. 10 of the farms used conventional practices. Interviewees were diverse in age, but most were similar in terms of being university educated, Singaporean born, with a family history of farming, and mainly growing vegetables on 2 to 3 hectare farms. The majority of farm labor, however, relied on immigrant workers from places like Myanmar, Bangladesh, etc. In addition to commercial orientation, these were not subsistence farms. Some of the farms provided multifunctional services to the urban system, specifically public and educational farm tours. In the case of the Singapore farmers, I also conducted a social and network analysis to understand the power of the farmers to access resources through the people that they interacted with across the food system. So here you can see a more clear diagram of how I conceptualized how farmers might access resources and who those other people might be. So if you remember, the food system is comprised of farmers. So I wanted to understand farmers' relationships with other farmers, as well as the market and vendors, the laborers that they hired, um, uh, customers, which is not on here, but also the landowner, which in this case was the government, and any other people they might interact with. And you can see the key at the top, and the farm itself is in the middle, surrounded by those different agents representing the different urban food system components. Here in the bottom, you can see 4 examples, all of the interactions and all of the nuances in the ways that each of those 4 case farmers interacted with and engaged with those actors across the food system. In summary, what I found, I looked at 3 levels of social networks. First was the resources embedded within the household itself. I created this mapping of all of the interviews that were conducted, and you can see that those with strong household social networks are marked with red circles, and then the yellow ones are those with weak social networks. And in summary, generally speaking, the farmers did not own their land. It was contracted, it was tenured. They did have permanent housing, and they were highly educated, and they saw their farming as a business. I also looked at proximal access. In this case, this related to other farmers, vendors, and customers, their hired laborers, and anyone else who was more proximal to them in terms of agriculture as a business. What I found was that the farmers were involved in a formal farmer organization. They generally had fixed vendor contracts. They provided their laborers with various resources such as dormitory space and, in some cases, both room and board. They had regular contact with customers at farmers markets, and they generally gave educational tours, which also connected them to customers. So in some sense, their proximal social networks were somewhat strong. And you can see here, there were no weak proximal social networks. They were all moderate to strong. In terms of distal relationships, I looked at farmers' access to resources through government agencies, the market as a larger conglomeration, the landlord, which in this case was also the government, as well as any other distal relations. What I found was that high tech was prioritized. So that created a weakness in their network because they were not preferred by the government's sort of vision of the future. However, they had strong connections through social media, education programs, and outreach, which gave them more of a strong distal network. In addition to understanding their social networks, I really wanted to get a very broad understanding of what was happening. And one of the critical barriers to access to resources for the farmers that I interviewed was a loss of agricultural expertise within the government agencies. And so here's a quote that I'll read. A farmer said, "We're supposed to contact AVA, which is the Agriculture Veterinary Association, because they are the body that's supposed to be taking care of us. But what I can tell you, every time we call, they don't respond, and they are not able to give us a solution. So they don't really help us. And then also, when you have diseases, fruit tree diseases, or your plants, you tell them, oh, what can I do? I don't have the expertise. My workers also don't know what to do." And they say, "Oh, sorry, we have also lost the expertise." And this is the agriculture department, because they no longer take care of these types of plants, you see. It's all leafy greens now, and very specific types of crops. So now they look at the landscape like that. They don't know what the hell you're talking about, so they can't really help us. I looked at a variety of benefits and barriers to understand more broadly what traditional farmers faced in the Singapore context. And these were some of the things that were summarized. First, one of the benefits that they really highlighted was the lifestyle and working on the land, having clean air and food, really the connection back to sources of food, it being good for their children. They knew that one of the barriers is that many of the policies and incentives now target high tech. The locals lack skills, stamina, motivation. Singaporeans are highly educated, so there's a need to import labor, and the migrants have limited English. Another barrier is the lack of land ownership and expiring leases. And in fact, many of the farmers that I had interviewed said their leases were to expire this year. So it's very likely that many of the farmers that I talked to either have already had to give up their land or have converted to high-tech options, which is not a simple transition. Also, the unique and diverse products are unwelcome. The government really is promoting uniformity, and the locals don't know local varieties. They want imports. So that's a real barrier when your customers aren't interested in what you're growing, and yet what you're growing is limited by the rules and regulations. And then finally, I found it really interesting that only 2 farmers mentioned climate change. So many of the benefits and barriers that they talked about were very immediate and direct impacts on their livelihoods, whereas climate change was sort of a more ambiguous future threat that they couldn't yet think about. And this is quite interesting because, as we know, Singapore is experiencing severe urban heat islands. Over the last few years, the average temperature has been climbing, and we're really at the threshold of comfort, and potentially at the threshold where most plants are happy. 32 degrees Celsius is where most plants become stressed because they cannot maintain hydration as easily above that temperature. And one of the farms that participated in my interview was featured in a news article pretty shortly after, and there was a lot of controversy over their situation because they were told that their lease was not going to be renewed, despite the fact that they were multiple generation farmers, and in fact they owned a home on the land. They had actual living house built on the land that they were farming. However, it was deemed that the land was to be taken back, and in addition to recouping the land, they were also told that they had to clear the landscape at their own cost. This despite the fact that they were not, they had been traditional farmers but had converted to hydroponics and some high-tech systems. So there was a lot of infrastructure that they had invested in that then had to be dismantled and taken away at their own cost. As I've mentioned, the Singapore government owns the majority of land in Singapore, and land ownership really is a serious issue when it comes to talking about the agrarian landscape. Lack of land ownership or insecure tenure is one of the primary drivers of unsustainable agricultural practices. We actually had one farmer tell us that he says, if you look at my piece of land, in 20 years, I've paid $3 million and he's referring to his lease rental rate. He goes on to say that when 20 years is up, the $3 million is gone. For Malaysia, the land appreciates in value. Now it's $1 million. After 10 years, it becomes 10 million. We are now zero. How are we to compete with the others? And so here is referring to the fact that Malaysia, where a lot of agricultural food is imported from, the farmers there will actually own their land. So the land becomes their own investment as part of the business revenue that they make every year. They've paid for the land is theirs. Whereas in Singapore, they keep paying for the land, but the land is never owned by the farmer. So it never becomes anything that they can invest in. Another challenge has to do with income diversification. one farmer said, our land use is agriculture, so it needs to be agriculture based. But after we started doing the restaurant and educational programs and things like that, we have coined the term called agritainment. And this term was then misappropriated by the Urban Redevelopment Authority. So when I build my restaurant and when I build my food museum and cooking school, I have to pay a differential premium because the land use has changed from agriculture to commercial. So this is really a disincentive for farmers to diversify their income. If the agriculture revenue is low, many farmers, even if it isn't low, many farmers will do different things to increase, value add and increase their income through other ways, kind of value added. However, it's clear that when this happens, in the case of Singapore, the land use can be reevaluated to a higher level, higher value, and they're taxed differently, which then negates their income, their new income. So there are many aspects to understanding traditional farming in Singapore through a political ecology lens. And a methodological approach is really about understanding the rich story or narrative of what is happening. And as part of a livelihood strategy, I wanted to understand what else the farmers would do if they no longer were able to farm, because it was clear that some of them, maybe many or most, would be losing their land, or in this case, currently, some probably have. And these were the different responses. First, and by the majority of farmers, they said that they potentially expatriate and farm in another country. So they really were invested in that farming livelihood. Many of them would probably simply move to Malaysia where they could purchase the land themselves. Other farmers thought they would move into the processing and distribution part, and not within the Singapore food system, but as an importer. Some of them who had a level of education mentioned going into accounting or marketing. Those with lower education said they would join Grab. And while others said that they might just move to other farms and give farm tours and get into agritourism. So it was clear that many of them wanted to stay connected to their agrarian roots, but others didn't really see any options and would be having to make total livelihood shifts. The final thing that I really grappled with was trying to understand the social construction of the farmer. And I'm going to come back to this later at the end of this lecture. But really, how we view the farmer is foundational to how we make rules and regulations about farming and the agrarian landscape. And this farmer said it quite succinctly in how farmers are viewed through the lens of social construction within the context of Singapore. The farmer said, if people aspire to be a farmer and agriculture is their first choice of degree, then it's different already. You get a different caliber of people. You don't glorify your farmers. You don't glorify your farm industry. In fact, the Minister of State himself said that farms are dirty, smelly, and not desirable, and hence we must go into urban high-tech farming. He told a room full of traditional farmers that what they did was dirty, smelly, and exactly, I'm surprised nobody stood up and scolded him. I mean, that's how he talked about farmers. This is the mindset of the leaders, then this is the mindset of the people. So in conclusion to this case study, it's clear that land is only one driver among many of the sustainability of the local Singaporean food system. With less than 1% of land in agriculture, Singapore is testing integrative approaches, but policies mainly support high-tech intensification and exclude traditional and agroecological approaches. I think there is a need to resolve regulatory and legal constraints on agriculture so that farmers can produce substantially more food in the city through a variety of different ways, not just limited to high-tech intensification. As urbanizing cities like Singapore face the double threats of urban food insecurity and land scarcity, diverse low to high-tech multifunctional agriculture needs to be a critical adaptation for its sustainability. I'm going to shift now to the political lens, the last of the three parts or prongs of the political ecology approach. And this is emphasizing social justice and structural political change that highlights the struggles, interests, and plight of marginalized populations. And first, I want to call attention to the photo here, which is oil palm plantation in Malaysia. I'm not going to spend any time talking about the palm oil industry, but there's a lot of discourse and criticism around it as an agriculture industry that takes advantage of marginalized groups and promotes environmental degradation. And I encourage you to spend some time educating yourself a little bit more about this, because we find palm oil in many of the foods that we eat. And as responsible stewards of the land, it's important that you understand where your food is coming from and the political, environmental, and social consequences of the things that you consume. That being said, let's go back to Singapore's food supply and look at it through a broader political lens. And the motivation for me to look at Singapore's food supply was not necessarily to look at Singapore itself, but to understand how how cities are necessarily reliant on their rural hinterlands, and how these hinterlands are becoming increasingly encroached upon by multiple urban centers. So my study was really an exploration of urban agriculture as an embedded practice, trying to understand how food security is impacted by changes in food production inside Singapore, but even beyond that, trying to understand where food is being imported from and how increasing competition for the same overseas rural food sources makes Singapore a critically sensitive food system. And here you can see, specifically, I looked at Kuala Lumpur, Jakarta, and Sydney as three urban centers that are located in three of the top countries that Singapore imports food from. And so if we go back to the Dakota diagram, we can start to understand Singapore as just one of those major cities that's dependent on these kind of peri-urban, Dakota, and rural agricultural contexts. As land competition rises, there has been the emergence of what is termed land grabbing. And I don't know if anyone is familiar with this. It's quite astounding. And basically, it's transnational land acquisitions where foreign countries acquire land and resources in other countries. Most commonly, investors or investing countries are located in the developing world, while the grabbed land is usually in developing countries. Basically, rich countries are able to buy themselves land in poorer countries. And you can see here where states that buy or lease land are mostly located, and states that sell or lease out land are located. And what's quite interesting is that China, India, and Egypt are both a buying land country as well as a selling land country. The 2008 global food crisis spurred another political effect. For example, in Jakarta experienced waves of rural to urban migration by those seeking better job opportunities. Nearly 3/4 of farmers migrated from across Java and Sumatra, and originating from more than a dozen different places across the two islands. While dates of migration generally range from as early as 1975 to as recently as 2013 in terms of concentration, the post-2008 crisis was particularly intense, with many migrant farmers who had been in agriculture growing rice on rented land or in sharecropping experienced severe economic losses and were driven to migrate, and especially to Jakarta. And so what we find now in Jakarta is any kind of undeveloped land can potentially be cultivated by migrants who don't own the land but are renting it, generally by developers who have purchased the land and are waiting for approvals to develop it. Another political context that I want to talk about is the ephemeral fringe. While this isn't necessarily a political movement, it's something that has direct implications on the policies and planning of the government. The peri-urban fringe of a city is not fixed. It moves further away from the urban core as the city grows outward. While it's pushed away from the urban core, it's uniquely tied to the city and remains within the sphere of influence. As roads and infrastructure are constructed to better link the urban core and urban fringe for commuting, land values tend to increase. It's on the fringe where agriculture tends to intensify and take advantage of proximity to urban markets, reliable water supply, and labor. However, the consequence is that agriculture on the urban fringe faces rising land values, land speculation by developers, and conflict with new residential owners over farm practices. For example, complaints about farm odors and pesticide spraying. While the conflicts of agricultural land use on peri-urban fringe are often highlighted, multifunctional benefits remain largely invisible. For example, Jakarta farmers tend plots that otherwise would have been the responsibilities of the city or an absent private owner to manage. So they're doing a city service without recognition that they're taking care of this land that would otherwise be the responsibility of the city government to manage. In addition to producing food, these farmers also manage vacant, underutilized, or public right-of-way land. And in fact, one of the farmers that I interviewed on the peri-urban fringe of Jakarta talked about the context of the land that he was cultivating. He was cultivating this plot of land that you see here, which he was renting, which was actually owned by an absent Indonesian Chinese family. The family had not subdivided land into residential plots like surrounding neighbors because they weren't quite ready to do that yet. I speculate that they're waiting for the land value to rise even farther. The farmers were allowed to farm in the land free of rent as long as it remained productive, giving the impression to the government that it wasn't neglected. So the landowner was gaining some sort of tax benefit by allowing the farmers to stay there. However, it was insecure tenure because at any point the land could be sold to a developer. Okay, so the final case study that I want to talk about is the case of Sydney farmers. And again, I was looking at power through their social networks and how they sustained productive livelihood. But I'm using the political lens to really understand the larger conditions and what they were facing. So a little bit of context. Sydney is the capital of New South Wales. It has a population about 4.8 million and a growth rate of 1.3% annually. It's on the central coast of Australia, has a humid subtropical climate, is surrounded by peri-urban farmland, creating a buffer between the city and the Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area. There's an estimated 2,000 vegetable growers, with more than 80% from non-Anglo cultural and linguistic backgrounds. Like many high-income global cities, Sydney's government endeavors to develop policies that enable development of the peri-urban boundary of the city in order to meet the housing, employment, practical needs of a growing population, while also aiming to protect and support local farmers, some being multi-generational, and these farmers contribute to the local food system stability. The diversity of farmers can be traced to post-World War II, when a wave of Southern European migrants were encouraged to settle in the new outer suburban housing precincts in an urban planning effort to avoid slum creation. The migrants started market gardens on their plots of land as livelihood means when they lacked language and other skills for employment elsewhere. At the time, land values were low at the peri-urban edge of the city, and farming enabled migrants to support their families and provide the city's markets with fresh food. In the subsequent decades, peri-urban agriculture has provided streams of migrants with opportunity to participate in farming. The main groups come from Lebanon, Malta, Vietnam, Cambodia, and China, many with rural backgrounds. This history of agricultural pioneering evolved a strong link between peri-urban farmers and local markets. The population of city continued to grow, and by the 1980s, the peri-urban agricultural land surrounding the city was regarded by the government as land waiting for higher economic development, a perspective reflected by landowners and developers. The peri-urban land that provided farmers access to urban markets, opportunity to tap into urban water infrastructure, and inexpensive land was also attractive to developers and those looking for more affordable living. So there's this tension that's starting to happen. And farmers were increasingly displaced as the Sydney population spread out of the urban core. McFarlane reported an estimate that growing corridors should consume approximately more than half the 2025 acres currently under production for vegetable growing in the Sydney area, and that overall, the Greater Sydney region will lose about 6,800 hectares of peri-urban land under Sydney by 2036. As the city government has focused on policies to support Sydney's position as a global city, and Australia's link to the global economy, the western suburbs emerged as greenfield housing developments for residents employed in the global market. Thus, the city sprawled and shifted towards a more global economy. The land values climbed, and the local market turned to cheaper food imports from overseas. Market factors have been a significant driver of the decline in urban and peri-urban farms, related to cheaper imports from overseas and supermarkets sourcing from farmers who produce cheaper through economies of scale. In an effort to remain competitive, farms have aggregated into larger farms, consequently becoming more reliant on irrigation, long-distance transport, and central processing. There is also the issue of the aging farmer population, who have children who are not interested in taking over the farm, and land holdings are being rezoned for residential use that offer high resale value for retirement. So the aging farmer population is probably not going to experience another generation of farming. In this context of urbanization, it was dawning that loss of farms in the region was more than just a loss of locally grown product. Peri-urban agriculture has many important benefits, including a range of ecosystem services, short food transport miles that translate to reduced carbon emissions, and meeting consumer demand for diverse local seasonal products. The 1998 Strategic Plan for Sustainable Agriculture, Sydney region, formally recognized that for agriculture to be sustainable in the Sydney region, it had to have community and political support. By 2004, the Department of Infrastructure, Planning, and Natural Resources released a Western Parklands Management Vision Summary Report. This was followed 1 year later by the Metropolitan Strategy, which aimed to provide green space for new suburbs called rural and lifestyle zones, or green zones. In an effort to resolve the tension between urban development and farming in the Sydney Basin. Specifically, the Metropolitan Strategy states that non-urban land will have greater recognition, so it's not treated as land in waiting for development. However, there's been criticism from academia and the public that the Metropolitan Strategy prioritizes the private housing sector, with decisions being made based on land that is best and highest use, with the greatest financial return. And in fact, I spoke with a farmer who told me that they had considered buying into this area and setting up a farming operation, but when they learned more about it, they realized that they were going to be vulnerable to potential development. And so they decided to move further into the rural context and buy land that was not under so much pressure for development. Okay, so this neoliberal framing of land prioritizes the economic potential over cultural and environmental values. However, as peri-urban areas become more fragmented, multifunctionality is also restricted. It's difficult to provide for example, stormwater mitigation when you don't have a continuous agricultural landscape, but rather it's in small patches that are disconnected. We have now reached a post-productivist era in which there is broad evidence and awareness of our finite resources. The case of Sydney's green zones is more than about the conflict between farmers and housing developments. It's about the changing urban food system from production to consumption and all the actors and processes that underlie this. Positively, there's growing support for locally produced food among Sydney residents. However, access to food and the sustainability of food chains requires a more comprehensive approach to understanding the urban food system. But it is not simply comparing alternative versus mainstream options, also referred to as local versus global food systems, because these are fundamentally interconnected. It's not a dichotomy. Further, in the context of Sydney, the spectrum of urban agriculture ranges across an ambiguous transect of rural to urban and supports social to community forms, from community gardens on one end to commercial high-tech farms, such as a high-tech mushroom industry that I found on the other end of the spectrum. Then there are cottage industries, niche production, and market gardens, which fill the middle. So really this urban-rural dichotomy is really a straw man because it's more of an integrated continuum than an either-or dichotomy. The pressure on land use for agriculture comes from a continuing trend towards displacement of agricultural land for affordable housing, increased competition from cheaper imported food, and the increasingly globalized food network. However, it is a combination of proximity to the urban market and embeddedness in urban economic, social, and ecologic systems that have a profound impact on the sustainability of urban and peri-urban farms. The aim of this research that I conducted in Sydney was really to understand the sustainability of the urban food system in Sydney by investigating commercial, urban, and peri-urban farms' access to resources through their social networks. What I found were three patterns, and this goes back to that urban-rural straw man. The first pattern was of farms located in the urban context and embedded in the local system. So they truly were urban agriculture functioning through short supply chains. Then there were farms located in the urban context and embedded in both the local and global system, where they were selling to local markets, but also selling to distributors overseas. And finally, there were farms located outside of the urban boundary, but selling exclusively to the local urban system. Social networks enabling exchanges of information and resources among farmers, as well as strong connections between farmers and customers beyond financial transaction through social capital, were really key characteristics underpinning the sustainability of the Sydney local food system. There is an argument for land use policies that preserve Sydney's surrounding farmlands, but land protection is a simplistic strategy for two reasons. First, farms who planned eventually to sell because the younger generation is not interested in farming, those farms will lose out on potential retirement income from rising land values. And second, land is only one driver among many of the sustainability of the local food system. At this stage of urbanization, protection of land might not be sufficient to secure enough land to produce a significant contribution of fresh product for the city. Furthermore, a new plan for integrating residential and agricultural land uses is controversial. And the one farmer that I mentioned earlier said a lot of land development was going on in the outer west of Sydney. We're looking at actually starting up a different farm on the government land. And it would have been like an educational school, but the red tape, I was like, I can't do it. I've looked at that a little bit. I've heard some feedback from other farmers too, and it's not positive. So with increasing pressures on peri-urban agriculture land for affordable housing, increasing competition for cheap imported food, and understanding how local food producers are leveraging social networks to be part of the local food system in a way that is sustainable economically, and in a way that provides a meaningful livelihood. These things can inspire city governments to develop more creative strategies for planning sustainable food systems. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the agrarian landscape in terms of agri-urbanism, as well as coming back to this concept of the farmer as a social construct. First, it's clear that urban agriculture is embedded in the web of infrastructure within the urban context. And there is a number of books that are being published recently, and I highlight this one here by April Phillips on designing urban agriculture, because it's not enough to understand agriculture in and of itself in order to design agrarian landscapes, but we really must think about how it's embedded and can be integrated and linked within that urban infrastructure web, from transportation to utilities, thinking about land use and natural resources, and particularly the social context. Urban infrastructure is a really important and critical opportunity for us to rethink how we can have agrarian landscapes as part of our urban and peri-urban context. But I want to caution against intensification of agriculture, because it's not a new idea, as witnessed with the Green Revolution. So we need to think about what is the future model. There are many options emerging with new technology adoption that improves food efficiency, and many of these, including hydroponic and aquaponic systems, are well suited to integrate with the urban infrastructures and combine with non-agricultural land uses. But with these diverse strategies and systems thinking, we have opportunity for cities to leverage services in addition to food production, to go beyond the efficiency and mechanization of the systems, to think about how urban agriculture can provide other benefits such as stormwater mitigation, building energy reduction, soil remediation, and other various ecosystem services. However, this kind of integration of urban agriculture as part of the city system requires diverse range of technical, scientific, planning, horticultural, and social expertise in order to be feasible and sustainable. And implications for land use planning are still being explored. We really don't know what the best innovative approaches are, but we are beginning to test out a variety of different approaches. It's clear that these kind of productive urban landscapes can support other social, ecological, and environmental benefits, filling gaps in local food access, supporting biodiversity. And they can manifest in a variety of forms with different functions, meeting different social, environmental, and economic needs. For example, cultivation on underutilized, marginalized land by low-income residents can serve one need versus contrasting that with a city park offering community garden plots to more affluent city dwellers for social interaction. Diverse production strategies such as community gardens, urban farms, edible school gardens, all of these fall under the broad umbrella of productive landscapes. And there are many new approaches, officially called New Forms of Urban Agriculture, NFUA, which are emerging that combine form and function in innovative ways as a reflection of local characteristics. Many cities currently focus on high-tech farming, but there are all of these other benefits that can be leveraged. Framing urban agriculture as embedded in the urban system challenges cities to address it not as a discrete activity, but as an important component of infrastructure and urban planning. Multifunctional land uses that integrate productive landscapes will be a critical adaptation for the sustainability of future cities. And now I want to share a very short video clip from The Dirt called The Edible City. In the Edible City video, we saw a variety of ways urban agriculture can be integrated in urban contexts. One way to begin to think about integration from the perspective of landscape architects and urban designers is by contextualizing the urban condition in order to develop best fit applications. From my perspective, an urban transect approach enables us to identify landscape typologies in and around the city from which we can narrow the scope of what can be feasible and sustainable. And in this way, you can see there's a list on the right-hand side here that combines a transect approach that looks at the urban to rural built environment combined with different ecological and social conditions that can be ways of categorizing different landscape typologies across that gradient. In an effort to be more systematic, we can characterize unique landscape typologies in terms of the form and function of agriculture that would be a good fit. Here's a table I've developed that provides examples of different kinds of characteristics of urban agriculture that would be particularly well suited for the different landscape typologies. And I'm happy to share this document. It's going to be published as part of a book chapter, so please contact me if you're interested in reading further about this. While form and function is certainly an important way to think about characterizing urban agriculture within the urban infrastructure system, what remains invisible? One thing that's still missing from the design approach is the urban farmer. It's something I think a lot about in my research, but that we easily overlook in practice. Yet the farmer, the person tending the garden, regardless of the shape, size, or technology, is fundamental to the sustainability of the system. Not just their skill set, but how we as decision makers view them in terms of their identity, how we socially construct them. This is reflected in our designs and our policies. So just a few examples from my own research to give you an idea of what I mean by the social construction of the farmer. going back to the Delhi farmers, they were viewed not as farmers, but as squatters. So while they were considered farmers in their rural villages, when they came to Delhi and settled on the floodplain, because they were renting the land informally, the city government saw them as squatters. And within this context, actually, from an outsider perspective, it's pretty easy to understand why they were not considered as valid stakeholders in the development of the land. Because this is the condition of their dwellings and their landscape plots. However, it's also clear from this image that they are unique stakeholders that are directly impacted by that development and could be an important voice in giving suggestions on how to integrate the needed infrastructure, in this case, metro construction, with the need to provide a more food secure agrarian landscape for the urban citizenry. On the other end of the spectrum, we move to Singapore, and while there are traditional farmers in Singapore, the social construction of the farmer that has a positive view in the eyes of the local government and planning agencies are farmers that are entrepreneurs, those that are focused on high-tech farming and innovative approaches. So as policies are developed, the entrepreneur farmer is the farmer that is considered as the important stakeholder in the planning the future city, whereas the traditional farmers are not considered, they're not considered as the core stakeholder. In this context, seeing the farmer as an entrepreneur allows a city to frame the issue of food security as an engineering problem to be solved through the adequate allocation of land and maximization of use in terms of infrastructure and high tech and innovation. Then the third case, I've also conducted some research in Turin, Italy, and I found that the social construction of the farmer there was really as a social advocate. So while the farmers were traditional farmers, they actually were supported by the local government, and their local identity, local cultural identity, was that of protector of local genetic heritage and protecting the local environment. And in that way, they were really integrated as part of the market system. So you can see here a farmer's market, and there were about 100 farmers markets operating daily throughout the city because of that positive social construction of their identity. And in fact, this was also reflected in planning of the city, where unlike many cities that had excluded agriculture as an valid urban land use, Turin is one of the unique instances where it's actually integrated as part of that larger urban city planning. So this brings me to the end of this very long lecture, and I'm glad that you went on this journey with me. I will end with a couple of websites for you to peruse if you're interested in learning more or doing some more digging. I'm also happy to talk further. I'm not providing any conclusions because there are none. And my hope is that what you take away is that this is a really complicated issue, and agrarian landscapes have many layers and many dimensions, and it's not black and white. In fact, it's not even really shades of gray, but it's a bit of a tangled, complex system that has many layers depending on what way you look at it, what scale, what time frame. So in any case, this is the end of the lecture. Next week, we're going to look at garden cities and how the garden city, in terms of a planning concept, has become in reality this approach to designing and building cities in a garden. And we're going to interrogate what that means. Finally, here are references, and thank you.